Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome back Michele Cho-Dorado. She's a pediatric gastroenterologist, and today's Kevin MD article is Empowering Our Children with Financial Literacy, Raising Bold Thought Leaders and Compassionate Change Makers. Michele, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much again for having me.
All right, tell us what your latest article is about.
Yeah, well, I have a strong passion for teaching kids about financial literacy, and this really stems from my own lack of financial education, which I realized much later in life. And so, what started out as me wanting to teach my own kids, I have two little kids myself, wanting to teach them these concepts early, just kind of grew into something, a bigger passion, I would say. And I think just, as I've been going down this journey with my own kids, I just realized that teaching kids about money just goes far beyond just money lessons. I really believe that it teaches kids about building leadership and having confidence. And I think a lot of vital life skills that, kids really benefit from and take with them into adulthood. So that's kind of the precipitous behind the article.
So tell us about your passion behind financial literacy. You're a pediatric gastroenterologist, and there's a stereotype, as you know, that physicians aren't the most financially savvy individuals. So tell
Yes.
us the genesis of your passion for financial literacy.
Yeah, so like I was just sharing, I personally, went through all of med school, residency, fellowship. I was almost a decade into practice before I realized that I had received very little financial education myself. I mean, I didn't even know what a Roth IRA was, and
Mhm.
this was me getting into marriage and having little kids at that point. And so I think it was just a bunch of light bulbs going off after I started educating myself, getting plugged into some other physician groups where I realized that I was not alone in this. And just having those realizations made me say, you know what? I want my kids to learn this stuff early. I just wasn't exposed to it at home. And, as you know, it's not taught to us in school. So if kids aren't learning it at school, then you have to teach them at home. Otherwise, you'll be like me, near 40 and before I even heard about what a Roth IRA was. And I think that's just unacceptable.
So, what are some of the lessons that you could share with kids? And then how old do these lessons get taught? And what are some of the ways that you teach them?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, when my kids were 1 and 3 is when I first had these realizations. And I don't know if we'll talk about it, but I ended up publishing children's books,
Hmm.
for my kids. And so my thought was that, even at that young age, they don't understand, like you can't have a discussion with them about money. But if you can even read them books or expose them to the words and the concepts, I just think that the more they hear the words, then the more they'll understand sooner and they'll be, maybe more easier to just, take it in. And kids are like sponges. So
Yeah.
if you're talking about these things openly at home, then they hear it, they're more familiar with it, and then they learn it sooner. And so I would say that's one of the first important lessons is just to start early. And I don't think it's ever too young. And second, also, kids, they habits form early. And so if you're teaching them concepts about like budgeting, for example, like every time they get money from their grandparents, you teach them to put aside a certain amount
Mhm.
into savings, put aside a certain amount into giving and budget your money and bucket them, then these habits start early. And so even as early as 7, habits formed by the age of 7. So I think that, teaching them these things early, modeling at home, and just being transparent with them, I think all those things just eventually will pay off.
Now, do you sit down with them and just have specific talks about financial literacy? Do you sprinkle it out throughout the day and, like you said, model it? So, give us some examples of how you interact with your kids regarding financial literacy.
Yeah, my husband and I are just very open about everything. So we just don't shy away from talking about money. I don't know about you, but for myself growing up, I grew up in an Asian household and my parents were immigrant parents and they just didn't talk about money. I think they
Hmm.
shielded us from it because they were working so hard that I think they didn't want us to feel like we had to worry about it. And so in effect, they just never talked about it. And because of that, I wasn't exposed to any of these concepts like investing. And aside from saving, like my parents taught me to save, money just wasn't discussed. And so that's something that we do very differently in our home is that we just talk about everything. We talk about what things cost. When we're spending money or saving money for a vacation or whatever it may be, we're just very open about it with our kids. And so I think transparency is very important. And so, it's not like we sit them down and like lecture them about, what it means to save or give. We just talk about everything that we're doing day to day. And I think that's probably one of the most important things you can do because, kids will do and model what they see, not what they're told.
Now, tell us about that lack of financial literacy, especially during medical education. And
Hmm.
like you said, that you do, a lot of physicians just aren't exposed to that, but comment on that lack of financial literacy among physicians.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're not learning in school, then for myself, I didn't know to ask about it or seek that knowledge out. And I think I had this belief that because I didn't really know much about money and I wasn't exposed to it, and I thought that I was not good at managing money because I just didn't know about it. And so that's just a belief that I told myself. And I realize now in hindsight that that's a limiting belief of mine, but it's a story I told myself. I don't know about money. I don't know how to manage it. I don't know about making investments, and I'm not good at it. And so I just didn't really even bother to try. Out of sight, out of mind, kind of is what I thought. And also, during that period of training, you don't have much money anyway, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like I felt like I needed to understand what I needed to do with my money because basically any money I was making was, going to my rent and just basic living costs. And so it's not like I had so much money that I was trying to understand, oh, what do I do with this excess amount of money?
Mhm.
No, that wasn't the case. But in hindsight, I wish I sought out information back then so I was prepared for when I graduate training and then you're making an attending salary, obviously there's a jump in income. I wish I knew better how to handle that and know how to better manage and put money aside at that point.
You make the connection between financial literacy and becoming a leader or change maker. So, talk more about that connection.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, when you're teaching financial literacy, when you have a solid foundation in financial education, I think that it allows kids to be more confident in their decision making. I think when you're teaching concepts around, for example, like investing, you're teaching them to, weigh risks and rewards, and you're making them, think about critical thinking. And, when you're teaching about giving, for example, you're teaching kids how to be more compassionate, teaching them empathy. When you're doing budgeting skills and things like that, then you're also building good habits, which I think leads to productivity. And so all those things I think are just, good vital life skills that kids
Mhm.
should know. And I think as you become more confident in making decisions, even especially when coming to money, I think then that builds confidence in other areas of your life outside of money. And so that leads, I believe, to leadership. I believe, just entrepreneurship, just being more curious, learning how to solve problems. I just think there's so many things outside of financial education that it affects.
So that, of course, applies to what we do as physicians as well,
Mhm.
because one of the biggest ways that physicians feel that they're burned out is because they're trapped, right? Because of
Yeah.
hundreds of thousands of dollars of student debt that they have to pay back. And if they're not financially literate, that albatross is going to keep them into a position that they may not like. So one of the biggest ways to, I always say, to combat burnout is to be financially independent. And that requires, of course, financial literacy.
Yeah. Yeah. And kind of to that point too, as I think that, the road in medicine is such a narrow path. And I think most doctors aren't encouraged to think outside the box. And, when we're talking about these skills of building leadership and being confident in thinking outside the box and being creative and, being curious about things, that's not how we're really taught in medicine. I feel like school does a really good job of teaching kids how to listen to the rules, do what they're told to do, not ask questions. And that's definitely how I led probably the first like couple decades of my life because that's what I was the typical type A good student that did everything I was told, followed all the rules. And only now can I see that I feel like that was a disservice. I did a disservice to myself because I wish I knew better to ask more questions and to, do things that maybe weren't expected of me. And so, you asked me, what else do we teach our kids? Well, we teach them it's okay to ask questions and to think a little bit differently, and that's okay. You don't have to follow exactly what other people do. And, there's a balance. I think, you need to be respectful, and there's still rules in the school and there's certain etiquette, but, just to understand that it's okay to sometimes bend the rules or challenge certain things. You don't have to just do what's expected because you don't want to, feel like the oddball out or something like that.
Now, was there a triggering event for you to think outside the box? Because you clearly have. You are an expert in financial literacy. You wrote children's book. You're passionate clearly about this, and obviously still a pediatric gastroenterologist. So, what was the inciting event for you to think outside that traditional narrow path of medicine?
Yeah, so honestly, it was when I started surrounding myself with other physicians who were doing things outside of medicine. And I think it was the first time I was exposed to that. And it made me think like, wow, look at these other people that are doing things differently. And it's something that was never on my radar before. And so once I started kind of learning more about what other people were doing. Honestly, I mean, this is a topic for a whole nother time, but I started learning about real estate investing
Hmm.
and it just kind of opened up my mind to new opportunities, what was possible. It made me look at my own identity as a physician, how I define myself only as a doctor, and that's all I thought I could be. And it was kind of getting past that and learning like, hey, I can be a doctor and be other things. I can
Hmm.
be a real estate investor, I can be an entrepreneur, I can be an author. And that was a process in itself, but that's probably the impetus.
One of the things that you talked about in your article is the concept of value creation. So,
Yeah.
talk more about that and its connection with financial literacy.
Yeah, so I think that this is a concept that I really love because, when you're talking about teaching kids about money, it's not about just accumulating money and hoarding money because, money's going to make you happy or if you make a certain amount that then you've made it. Obviously, we know that's not the case. Money doesn't buy happiness. And I think it's important to teach kids not to tie money to self-worth, to
Hmm.
disassociate those two concepts. I think it's important for kids to learn that money is a tool, not a goal. And so, to be able to use money to make an impact, I think is really important. And I think one way to do that is to teach kids that tie money to value. And so if they create value where value is created, money comes, right? And so I think that's something that again we try to emphasize to our kids. It's not just about making money and buying material things and getting a big house and all these things. It's really, having good stewardship of money, but also in order to earn, you tie it to something like something that you're creating value-wise.
We're talking to Michele Cho-Dorado. She's a pediatric gastroenterologist, and today's Kevin MD article is Empowering Our Children with Financial Literacy, Raising Bold Thought Leaders and Compassionate Change Makers. So, give us some examples in terms of how financial literacy really can change not just kids but physicians that you've seen. And, you're around a lot of physician entrepreneurs. Just tell us about how that financial literacy can really propel them into being leaders and change makers.
Well, I think that, money in itself is such an area of conflict, right? It's a source of conflict and fear for many people. In fact, we know that money is one of the top sources of stress and divorce among couples. And so I think that if you can be open about money topics with your partner, with your family, I think that that really sets you up for healthy communication, I would say. And I think that obviously healthy communication makes you happier. I think also when we're talking about families, we hear a lot about generational wealth, family legacy, and I think that when you look at families who have successfully transferred wealth across generations, one of the things that they do very well is that they talk about money and they teach their kids about it. And so things like teaching value creation, things like teaching kids how to have healthy struggles and teaching resilience and transferring your values to your kids, I think sets them up for success, not just individually, but for them to then pass that on to the next generation. And so, we as parents want to set our kids up and we always say, like, okay, we'll pass on an inheritance to them, or we want to save money and so that we can pass on to their kids. But what good is it if you're not transferring your values and
Mhm.
then they get all this money and they just squander the money? Because that's what the statistics show, that 90% of wealth in wealthy families is gone by the third generation. And I think that one of the things that you can do to prevent that is to transfer your values, talk about money, and teach them in the way that we're just talking about.
Now, before physicians are comfortable talking about financial literacy with their kids, they themselves have to
Yes.
learn that. So, tell us some resources where they can get started.
Yeah, I mean, some of the early books that I read were The Psychology of Money. Rich Dad Poor Dad obviously is one of the most common ones. The Simple Path to Wealth. So some kind of high yield about talking about the market. That's something that I didn't know about the stock market
Hmm.
even. And so I think that just kind of breaks it down and makes it easy. But honestly, it's a lot in the mindset. I think that, having a growth mindset is very helpful because even when it comes to money, understanding that there's abundance. And so, somebody else having more doesn't prevent you from having more. And so I think those are, things to really remember as you're kind of going through this journey. But yeah, those were probably the first couple books that I read, and obviously there's so many more, but yeah.
And we'll end with some take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
Yeah, I would say number one, start early. It's never too young. On the flip side, it's never too late. I think some parents have teenage kids and they think like, oh shoot, I haven't talked to them about this stuff, or, they're teenagers, and every parent doesn't want to have kids that are feeling entitled, right? But I think it's never too late to start. You can still incorporate these lessons and model behavior at home. So start early is number one. Number two, I would say be transparent. Again, model the behavior that you want your kids to learn at home because they will learn from what they see, not they hear what they hear. I would say also teach gratitude. I think that's really important. I think if you're teaching your kids to be thankful for what they have, they're less likely to focus on what they don't have. And then they're also more likely to see that they can help others. And so I would say probably those are the top three.
Michelle, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight. Thanks again for coming back on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.